Kia ora, Kirsten here, one of the producers of the show. A quick content warning, this series deals with abuse, including child sexual abuse and domestic violence. So listen with care and see our show notes for details of support services if you need them. This podcast is funded by New Zealand On Air.
In the church that Gayleen grew up in, they'd sometimes do these things called firesides. No actual fires involved. Rather, it would be an evening meeting where a church leader would speak on some topic or other, and members, perhaps a youth group, perhaps adults, would be encouraged to discuss it and ask questions. Once, when Gayleen was in her early teens,
somewhere between 12 and 14,
she went to one of these firesides. This time, there was more than one speaker.
We went from room to room getting different lessons.
And in one room, there was a lesson that has really stuck in Gayleen's memory. The bishop's wife, who was leading the discussion, had put a cake on a table at the front of the room. It was quite the cake.
This really, really beautiful looking, very white cake. And it was almost sparkling with sugar crystals.
The youth group knew that the theme of the lesson was chastity. But the cake? They weren't sure what that was about. But then
she said, "Who would like a piece?"
Well, of course, everyone wanted a piece. But
then she got this handful of dirt, like dirt from the ground, and threw it all over the cake. And she said, "Who wants a piece of cake?" And no one then wanted a piece of cake.
So the cake, you got this already, is a metaphor.
She likened that to being pure and chaste and keeping ourselves clean versus if somebody touched us inappropriately or kissed us or anything, how then we weren't clean and nobody would ever want us.
That was 40 years ago, but the memory has always stayed with Gayleen. I mean, seeing an adult throw dirt over a cake is pretty memorable under any circumstances. But the bigger point the bishop's wife was making was that if you were impure, if you were unchaste, if you were the dirt-spattered cake, you would be imperiling your chances of getting into heaven. But missing out on heaven, that was taking the long view. The more immediate incentive to keep in line was that
if you did make a mistake, you would end up in the bishop's office.
And there were so many mistakes you could make in this church. So many rules that could be broken.
No tea or coffee.
You don't ever swear.
You can't be involved in sexual relations before marriage.
Don't watch TV on Sunday.
This podcast is all about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. You'll hear about the things they believe.
Āpiti hono, tātai hono. The living can also be united with the dead.
You'll learn about the importance of service and obedience.
I was just a full-on soldier for the church.
And the unbreakable commitments that people in the church make.
There is nothing that would warrant breaking up a family.
Commitments that lead members to put the church first.
If the church gets embarrassed, I get embarrassed.
No matter the cost.
I did what I was supposed to do. I told my bishop.
A church wouldn't deliberately put a child in harm's way.
They kept insisting that I needed to forgive him.
I'd just tell the helpline and they can make it all go away.
Is this the LDS Church Abuse Helpline?
Who am I speaking to?
This is Heaven's Helpline, a 6-part New Zealand Herald investigation into the Mormon Church in New Zealand. Episode 1, The Business of Saving Souls.
Where are we?
We're heading on to State Highway 1. So we're in South Auckland, or heading into it, I should say.
And why are we here?
Because I'm going to show you the Mormon Temple, Adam. The Auckland Mormon Temple. This recording's from a couple of months ago. I was with Adam Dudding, one of the producers for this podcast. I wanted him to see what I'd been seeing every time I drove south of Auckland, and every time I drove back. And boom! There it is.
Okay, that is really absolutely stonkingly huge.
Yeah, it's been going up for a couple of years now. Every time I drive to Hamilton and come back to Auckland, I see it getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's nearly done. I'm Murray Jones. I'm an investigative journalist, and yeah, it's fair to say over the past couple of years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, better known as the Mormons or the LDS Church, has become a bit of an obsession for me. The church, its money, its vast new Auckland temple. But I think it's so noticeable, right? It's put right up on the hill. It's looking over the whole of Manukau. It's really quite a big statement from the church. You know, when I first started writing 2 years ago, I didn't even know the Auckland temple was coming up. And then so the fact that this huge temple is being built in the city I've been living in just as I've been introduced to the Mormons. This obsession began not long after I arrived in New Zealand from the UK. You might have spotted from my accent that I'm not from around these parts originally. I got a contract to help NZME's business desk with a project looking into charities and their money. Which ones are rich? Where does the money come from? How do they spend it? That kind of thing. And really quickly, it became obvious that the LDS Church was worth a close look, because it turns out they are mind-bogglingly rich, and there are all kinds of fascinating side issues around their wealth. Like the way they tithe 10% of all their members' incomes, many of whom aren't all that rich to begin with, or the fact that they spend just a tiny fraction of that tithe money on the kind of things you might expect from a charity. You know, soup kitchens, or helping the homeless, or running hospitals. Or the way that the Mormons have this huge focus on constructing these extravagant and expensive temples all over the world, just like the one in the south of Tāmaki Makaurau. Anyone who's driven or flown into Auckland in the past couple of years will have noticed it.
I mean, it's quite beautiful though, isn't it? I mean, I'm just looking back at it now, you know, the spire sort of goes up like a 10-layer wedding cake.
Yeah, 60 metres. Although I was focused on the New Zealand LDS Church, I couldn't ignore the global wealth of the Mormons. They've got investments worth $260 billion US. That's more than the annual GDP of New Zealand. Anyway, when my articles came out, well, they got a pretty big reaction online. Journalists like to pretend that we don't read the comments on our stories, but of course we do. And these ones were fascinating. There were non-religious readers outraged that churches have tax-free status at all. There were current members of the church coming to its defence, saying that my articles were a hit job by a so-called journalist. But there were also conversations kicking off in the comments that made me realise there was more to say about Mormon money. There were some heartbreaking accounts of the way tithing had been really punishing for members. One woman talked about how she still felt emotionally scarred by
the realisation that I could have provided my suicidal teen the specialist therapy the bishop refused to help pay for if I hadn't been paying tithes for decades.
One woman talked about how she was asked by a senior church leader
to pay tithing on my student loan because I was receiving money.
Another woman, commenting from Salt Lake City, Utah, the home of the Mormon faith, said she'd been led to believe that if you pay tithing, the Lord will provide, but...
Funny, once we stopped paying tithing, we had enough on our own. What a scam.
Reading all these, I wanted to do some follow-up stories on the human cost of tithing, and also hear from more women, since most of the people in my original Mormon money articles were men. So, I sent messages to a dozen or so of the people who'd made comments. Would they be interested in telling their stories in a bit more detail for a follow-up article? Half of those people got back to me. Half of that half agreed to a phone call. And one of those three people, well, she didn't want to talk to me about tithing. She wanted to talk about something much, much darker. That first call lasted for a couple of hours.
And so you think you're the only one in such desperate circumstances. So that's the mentality I had at that time.
And to be honest, it shook me.
So I'm a bit lost for words.
Yeah, it's not easy. It is hard to understand.
This woman, who I'll be calling Caroline, said she had been in the church for more than 40 years before finally leaving. Her story was one of betrayal.
You just trust that the leaders are going to take care of things.
Trauma and denial.
I cut myself off from everything. I cut myself off from the news, trying to protect myself.
Of missed opportunities and cover-ups.
You said that people knew he was predatory. Who knew, and what did they know?
But talking to her also made me realise I needed to be asking some very different questions about the church. Yes, the church is rich, and sure, it's important to look closely at the burden that tithing places on some members. But after talking to Caroline, it got me wondering about things like, who does the church value and who do they see as expendable?
If you feel superior to somebody, it becomes real easy to just say, oh, well, wouldn't have happened to my kid.
Who holds power in the church? And how do they use that power?
Everything good that your family wants of you, you have to get this person's approval. The opportunity for abuse is immense.
And when things go wrong, when lives are ruined, when families are torn apart, when crimes are committed, what will the church do to keep things quiet?
Handle the problem, kill it off, get the victim to forgive.
It would be almost 2 years before some of those questions were answered. And we're going to get to all of that soon. And yes, we are going to come back to Caroline and hear her whole story. But first, we need just a bit of context about this church. Where did it come from? And how did it make it over to Aotearoa? Mormon history is really fascinating. We're going to give you the potted version here, but if you're keen to understand more, then listen to our explainer episode in the podcast feed. So, in 1820s New York State, a young man called Joseph Smith had some religious visions which told him not to follow any of the current churches out there, but to set up his own instead. The way Smith tells it, he was first visited by God and Jesus. Then one night in 1823, an angel called Moroni appeared in his bedroom.
Standing in the air, for his feet did not touch the floor.
Moroni showed Joseph the location of some golden plates that were hidden near his home.
He said there was a book deposited, written upon gold plates.
Under divine guidance, Smith translated the pages, and those translations became what's known as the Book of Mormon. It has a huge narrative spanning centuries, climaxing with Jesus visiting the Americas after his resurrection. Smith was into polygamy, the practice of men taking multiple wives. This would get the church in trouble with wider American society, so they fled westwards and set up shop in Salt Lake Valley, Utah, which has remained the beating heart of the church ever since. Just a quarter century after the Book of Mormon was published, in the 1850s, the first LDS missionaries arrived in New Zealand. They had minimal success converting European settlers, so turned their focus to Māori. And it went really well. Large numbers of tangata whenua joined the church. There's a number of reasons that people point to for this. Language, ancestry, polygamy, and prophecies all played a part. But crucially, unlike European missionaries, American Mormons weren't involved in the British Crown's land grabs. But again, we dive into these factors in the explainer episode. Whatever the specific reasons though, the fact is Mormonism became really big in Māoridom. By the 1960s, over 60% of the membership of the LDS Church was Māori.
So can we go inside this thing?
No, so only the most worthy of church members are allowed to go in. It's where special rituals and ordinances happen. So you've got your sealings, which are your weddings, you've got your baptisms of the dead, you've got your endowments. So not anyone can just go in at any time. It's only for special situations and ceremonies.
Watch out for that truck.
Temples are one of the most important symbols of faith for Latter-day Saints. Sure, they have churches all over, but temples are much more rare and much more special. As I mentioned there to Adam, only those who are deemed to be behaving well enough according to church doctrine are allowed inside the temple. This new temple in the south of Auckland will no doubt be a huge deal to the many members living nearby. But if you wind the clock back to the construction of this country's first Mormon temple in 1958, well, it literally shifted the landscape.
An American-style suburb sprang from the swamp, and Tuikaramia became Temple View, a beautifully landscaped village snugly enclosed by 1,000 acres of church-owned farmland.
That was from a 1973 documentary, marvelling at how the church had built a self-contained community in the Waikato. centered around a brand new temple, a vast white building with a sharp spire reaching for the sky. This was just the 11th Mormon temple in the world, so it was a matter of enormous prestige and pride for New Zealand Mormons. The school next door, Church College, was a co-ed secondary school that took boarders and day students. The temple, the school, and the houses of Temple View were all built by volunteers, called labour missionaries. Their mantra was Kia hanga mo tunu ake, build for eternity.
The labour missionaries were just ordinary people who were mostly Māori being missionaries.
That's Dr. Gina Colvin. Her whānau have been Mormon for generations. And although Gina has been a vocal critic of the church over the years, she's only recently left. The idea of Temple View was to build a community where Mormon families could flourish and look after each other. But for some of the Māori among them, it was something even more.
You know, after generations of having your land and your livelihood taken away from you through the confiscations and the land grabs and all of the agony and the traumas that were as a result of that, it was phenomenal, I think, to be part of something that built something for Māori and for their spiritual flourishing and their spiritual welfare.
Mormons flocked to live near the temple. Some came from Pacific nations or from Australia, places which at that time didn't have temples of their own. Remember Gayleen, the woman who watched someone throw dirt all over a white cake when she was a kid? Her family moved from Dunedin to live near the new suburb.
We moved up here, and that was different because, there were Mormons everywhere. You'd go to the supermarket, you'd bump into them. You'd walk down the road, you'd bump into them. You wanted to talk to someone, and it's just over your fence or down the road. They were everywhere.
Temple View's still a really distinctive place, although it's much quieter since the school shut down in 2009. The whole suburb, which is southwest of Hamilton City, is a little bit eerie if you drive into it without realising what it is. A tiny land island of suburbia, centred around spotless white buildings in the middle of farmland. There's around 1,200 residents, and just about everyone that lives there is a Mormon. For a very long time, this really was the epicentre of Mormonism for the whole of the Pacific region. Many of the people you'll meet in this podcast lived in or near that suburb, or studied at Church College, or married their spouse at that temple. But even though it's kind of a religious enclave, and even though this is a really tight-knit community, Mormons haven't completely separated themselves from mainstream New Zealand. We've had Mormon All Blacks, including Jonah Lomu, Ma'anonu, and in the 60s and 70s, the Going Brothers, Sid, Brian and Ken. We've had Mormon Olympians, including Valerie Adams and Joseph Parker. There have been Mormon Miss New Zealands. One of them made it to the top 7 in Miss World.
Miss New Zealand.
My name is Vicky Lee-Hemi. I'm a student teacher and I'm studying English and education.
There are New Zealand judges who are Mormon, Mormon politicians. I mean, our third most recent Prime Minister was a Mormon.
I was Mormon. I lived in Morrinsville. And while I loved politics, I never, ever dreamed I would work in it.
Jacinda Ardern quit the church in her early 20s for reasons we'll get to, but her family is still very involved. Her uncle Ian is a senior leader and was principal of Church College in the 1980s. The church has made a real effort to help the country understand that they're pretty decent folk. Since the mid-1980s, the people of Temple View have put on their epic Christmas lights extravaganza. And around the same time, in 1981, the church commissioned a documentary for the New Zealand audience.
They've asked me to tell you a little bit about themselves.
Narrated by 5-star, gold-plated New Zealand hero Edmund Hillary, who, as you know, climbed Mount Everest before anyone else.
For the Mormons, the most important single unit in the church is the family.
To be clear, Hillary was not a Mormon himself, but as he put it,
maybe they didn't convert me to anything, but I couldn't help admiring their politeness and their sincerity.
Clean-cut, family-focused, hard-working, polite, harmless. And that's the space, more or less, where Mormons have sat in the eyes of non-Mormon New Zealand for a good half-century or so. A minority religion, 54,000 members according to the 2018 census, closer to 120,000 according to the church's own figures. A church whose followers here are mostly Maori and Pacifica, but a sizable minority of Pākehā, with some doctrinal quirks that make it a bit different from a lot of other Christian churches. A bit old-fashioned, a bit straight, and sure, outsiders might find some of their rules and rituals a bit unusual, worthy of a bit of teasing. Like in the TV show, South Park.
That's another thing! Why do you have to be so freaking nice all the time? It isn't normal!
Or in the hit Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon, which was written, incidentally, by the creators of South Park.
I believe that the Garden of Eden was in Jackson County, Missouri.
Or this sketch from the mid-1980s New Zealand comedy show, Funny Business.
I don't drink coffee. I don't drink tea. And I enjoy celibacy.
And I don't know if there's any connection between that kind of teasing and the fact that around 2009, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints started distancing itself from the label Mormon and insisted that people refer to the religion as LDS, or by its full wordy title. Most members I spoke to still refer to themselves as Mormons, even though it's no longer the official line.
I'm a Mormon. Norman the Mormon.
But if the worst thing you're known for is your straight-laced faithfulness and your Christmas lights, then reputationally speaking, you're not doing too badly.
My name is Elder Norman.
After the break,
I'm a knock on your front door, man. I'm a Mormon.
we meet the door knockers. For us non-Mormons, the most likely way we've interacted with a Mormon is when a couple of clean-cut young men in black suits and shiny shoes with a little black name tag saying Elder Smith or Elder Jones have turned up at our door.
My name's Elder Smith.
Maybe you've politely shut the door.
We represent
What are you doing?
Maybe you've chatted on the doorstep for a
an
bit.
international program called a Family Home Evening Program. It shares
Maybe you've invited them in.
I want you to know that it's a pleasure for us to be with you tonight.
And just maybe, you liked what you heard and ended up joining their church.
When I was about 5 years old, 2 Mormon missionaries knocked on my mum's door.
This is Marlon Dean.
And my mum became interested in the messages that they had to share and felt that the values and the principles that the church had really resonated with her and aligned with how she wanted to live her life and bring up her family. As a consequence, she was starting to attend church.
This was the mid-1970s. Marlon's father came on board a couple of years later. So now the Deans were Mormons. They lived in Wairoa, just down the road from Nuhaka, home to one of the oldest Mormon meeting houses in the country. A majority Maori area with strong historical connections to the church. When he was 13, Marlon was sent off as a boarder to Church College. Remember, that's the Mormon high school right next to the temple on the fringes of Hamilton. For Marlon, this was life-changing.
It was a massively positive experience for me. The highlight of my life, you get to connect with youth from all around New Zealand. I was in a dormitory with 60 to 70 other boys, and so from my years of being 13 right to 18, that was my life.
Everything at Church College was geared towards the teachings of the church. All the teachers were Mormons. There was extra scripture study after school. And also, because of the American influence, they played a lot of basketball. And they were really good. At one point, they won the national champs 8 years in a row.
My teammates were Mormon, my roommates were Mormon. So they become your friends for life, and they still are friends in some respects today.
Gayleen, whose family had moved from Dunedin to be close to the temple, she went to Church College too.
I always remember thinking if I wanted a good academic grounding, I probably shouldn't have gone to Church College.
But that kind of wasn't the point.
It was about building your spiritual life.
And the building blocks of a spiritual life Rules. Lots of rules. Some were around your schedule.
You don't watch TV on Sunday. You don't study on Sunday.
How you should speak.
You don't ever swear. You can't even use the word pig because you may as well swear. That's saying something bad to somebody.
What you eat and drink.
I don't know if you've heard about the word of wisdom.
This is the law that says no tea, coffee, alcohol, tobacco or illicit drugs.
And stitched onto the hot drinks was the idea that one of the bad substances was caffeine, and Coke had caffeine, so that was commonly accepted as part of the word of wisdom.
It's not bad advice. In fact, a study in Utah showed that Mormons lived 6.5 years longer on average than non-Mormons. But the rule that was drilled home more than any other was how you should absolutely keep to the law of chastity.
We're all striving to get married in the temple, and if you ruin it once, then you've spoilt your chance.
What you do affects so much the boy.
This is from a 1980 documentary about the Mormon Church. And this is a middle-aged man speaking to a teenage girl in a mixed-gendered seminary class about how girls should behave.
And the reason he's all over you is not necessarily that he's that way inclined, but because you've stirred him inside. Because of your shoulders, because of the way you wear your dress, see-through tops can do terrible things to boys. They really can.
Gayleen says she took those childhood lessons really seriously and carried them well into her adulthood.
I had to obey the rules with exactness because I was the black and white person, and I thought that was good then.
For both sporty Marlin and studious Gayleen, getting through school was just the warm-up act for the most important act of service and rite of passage that a young Mormon can do. Going on a mission. Going on a mission to knock on doors, to proselytize, to attempt to convert non-members is an absolute cornerstone of Mormon life. The church estimates that since its founding, more than 1 million Latter-day Saints have served a full-time mission. You could think of it as being a bit like military service. You're sent out into the world for up to 2 years, quite possibly to another country, as a kind of soldier of the Lord doing a tour of duty. It usually starts with a couple of weeks of what's basically biblical boot camp. Would-be door knockers attend a missionary training centre, or MTC, where they learn the rudiments of preaching the gospel to total strangers. Then you're off, saving as many souls as you can. It's a massive global operation, and it helps the church grow. In 1990, the year both Gayleen and Marlin began their missions, the church claims it converted more than 300,000 people, a high watermark in church history. And for young Mormons themselves, it's a chance to serve the church they love.
It showed that I was a good, faithful member of the church, and that's what we were all striving to be.
And to make your family proud. And of course, there's FOMO.
Some of my best friends were already out and they were sending letters. They were saying they're having a great experience.
Marlin again.
And so you sort of think, well, what else am I going to do? You can't just go surfing by yourself.
Oh, and did we mention? You have to pay for it yourself.
They recommended you save $16,000 back in those days.
Quite a lot of money.
And that was a lot.
Marlin pulled together the funds with help from its hard-working family, plus a church sponsor. Gayleen scrimped and saved for years so she'd be ready for her call to mission. And sure enough, just as her last year at uni wrapped up, the call came. Destination Christchurch.
We had 55 of us crammed into this little mission training centre.
Gayleen had always thought of herself as a pretty hardcore believer, a rule follower, the righteous Mormon.
But when I got there, everyone's all righteous as well. So I remember thinking, gosh, this really is the army of the Lord.
And the Lord's army was busy. Once the training weeks were over, the big door-knocking days began.
You woke up at 6:30, half an hour to shower and make your bed. Study at 7, you would have study for an hour with a break for breakfast. 9:30, you're out on the job, peopling all day. An hour for lunch and dinner. You had to write in your journal, to update the missionary records. So very exhausting. And then you'd go to bed and start it all again.
And that was 5 days a week.
Oh, except for church on Sunday. And then on a Monday, you would have till 6 o'clock to shop, to wash your clothes and clean your house and that kind of thing.
That was called your preparation day, or P-Day. But it wasn't a full day off. After 6 p.m, you had to head back out for an evening's proselytising. Out on mission, Gayleen discovered there was one more rule.
We weren't allowed to listen to any music that wasn't put out by the church. We were allowed to listen to a group called Afterglow.
Half the battle is asking the Lord. It's a little bit scary 'cause I know His word. The commandments been given.
Marlin started his mission the same year as Gayleen, but he was called to Sydney, whose territory included pretty much all of New South Wales. Rules differ from mission to mission, and poor old Marlin wasn't even afforded the meagre joys of Afterglow. At his MTC in Sydney, there was no music allowed at all.
I love music, so that was really, really hard for me.
He struggled with a lot of things at first.
So I was very shy, didn't know what I was doing, certainly didn't know any scriptures, so I was really raw arriving into Sydney. And for the first part, I was just following the senior companion.
On your mission, you're assigned a companion, and you cannot leave their side. The pair of you is known as a companionship. Every waking minute is spent with them. The only time you're not in each other's eye line is when one of you goes to the bathroom, and even then, your partner has to wait right outside. Marlin was shy and was anxious about speaking in public, but he compensated for that in other ways.
I have a capacity for work. My family are workers, so worked in shearing sheds and out on the land. I just figured I might as well just work as hard as I can. So I would knock doors all day, every day until people tell me to go away, and I wasn't afraid of doing that.
You can knock all you like, but it's hopeless unless you're making some conversions. Marlin and his fellow missionaries had monthly conversion targets, and they simply weren't meeting them.
We would maybe do 7 to 10 a month across 200 companionships. So we were struggling.
But then a new senior leader arrived at the mission, and he quickly impressed Marlin.
He's a businessman, self-made millionaire. He was very motivational. He was charismatic.
This guy set wildly optimistic monthly targets.
We said, well, we're not going to try to get to 50, we're going to try to get to 150.
And he showed Marlin's cohort some tips for hitting those targets.
I thought, what the heck, I may as well apply those scripts and those tools and techniques. And I was starting to get success.
Scripts? Tools? Techniques? I'm intrigued. What does it take to save a soul? As a journalist, I've introduced myself to a fair number of strangers. Sometimes they're a bit hesitant to talk to me, and I need to win them round. But convincing someone to join your church, to experience a spiritual conversion, to have a religious experience, that's a whole nother ballgame. But it was a skill Marlin got down to a T. So, here's how he did it. Perhaps the most important step of all was the first one, preparation. Practicing and memorising those scripts Marlin mentioned.
We had a sequence of words, actions and gestures that are designed to create an emotional connection.
And this included the way you talked.
There's a certain cadence and even when to pause.
So, once you're actually on someone's doorstep and they haven't slammed the door on you, where do you start? Well, Marlin would start here.
We're messengers of Jesus Christ. We're here to talk about the purpose of life. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going after this life is over? Have you ever wondered about the purpose of life?
At the same time, Marlin would be trying to glean some basic information.
Getting to know them, we would find out about what's important to them and then match the message to what's important to them emotionally. So whether it was...
He acknowledges now that often it was easier to make headway with people who were vulnerable in some sense.
Looking back, I think they were socioeconomically challenged a little bit. They were searching for support in their community, a little bit isolated. People that are questioning what the purpose of their life is, that are experiencing some heartache, whether that's some financial struggles, whether that's some loss of a loved one. And I would tailor the message. So I knew that I would get a better result if I spoke on the door about those types of things.
Next step, if the conversation was flowing, he'd lean into those tough subjects. Like, if Marlin found out they'd recently lost a loved one, he'd say,
"You will see them again." if you endure to the end, you will be with them together forever. How good would it feel for you to be with them and see them again?
Or he might get really specific.
With your daughter who's next to you, how would you feel if you were to live forever with your wife and your daughter? As we share these messages with you, you're going to have feelings in your heart and in your mind.
I want to dig in for a moment to this emotional triggering of the investigator. That's the missionary's term for someone who hasn't closed the door on them. So, Marlin says he and his fellow missionaries became so confident that they could evoke these kind of emotions, that they'd even warn them in advance that it was coming. A bit like a stage magician who tells you to watch extra closely because that coin in their hand is about to disappear, but you still don't see how they did it.
So be sensitive to those feelings in your heart and your mind as we share this message. Then we share a message and we go, how do you feel in your heart right now? And we were told, pause and wait. And then you would say these words, I feel peace and calm in my heart. This feeling is the Spirit. And it's the Holy Ghost telling us today that what we've shared with you is true, that we are messengers of Christ.
Wow, that pause. So simple. Yet for Marlin, so effective. And the final step? Closing the deal. Marlin would invite the investigator to make a specific date that would then move them towards getting baptized and completing their conversion.
That was the most powerful time to get them to make a commitment because they're feeling an emotion. We would attach the emotion to that is the Spirit of God, confirming to you that this is the right thing to do. I feel very strongly that the week of the 25th or whatever it was, give them a date. That's what I'm feeling in my heart, and it must be true because you're feeling it too. So that's how I would set a date.
Just because Marlin had memorized the scripts and was acting them out didn't mean he didn't believe in what he was doing.
But I really felt I was a representative of Jesus Christ. You were even told in your missionary commission to say and do what he himself would say and do if he was talking to the very people to whom you are ministering.
And if you're showing up for Team Jesus, you can't exactly half-ass it.
But I was representing Jesus, so I've got to give it my best shot. So part of what we do is crying as an emotion would be translated as feeling the Spirit. So my goal was to get the investigator to cry, and if they cry, they buy, was how I'd viewed it.
It was exhilarating, and Marlin worked hard.
It sounds delusional now, but I was like, even if we were walking to the bus stop or to the train station, I was just talking to anyone because I felt I had to save souls. And then to be able to give an accounting by the end of my mission that I fucking did as much as I could do. So I was totally focused. I was just a full-on soldier for the church and loved it.
Marlin's worked hard to memorize all scriptures, all the tactics and scripts, and he's out there beating the streets, knocking on doors.
I was just all-in animal.
His relentless efforts and his knack with the pause paid dividends. When he baptized 3 families in a single Sydney street, mission leaders noticed and gave him a role training up newbies. Now he'd become the guy he'd looked up to 18 months previous.
I'd take them out knocking doors, show them how to do it. I would teach them the scripts, do the training. That was my life. I was the dude on my mission. Yeah.
So that was Marlin's dude journey. A 2-year transition from shy but hardworking kid to an extraordinary salesman for God. Once back in Hamilton, he also discovered there were other ways to use his newfound skills. He moved swiftly into a very successful career in sales for the fishing industry and media, and then selling gym memberships.
I was in Australia telling Australians you couldn't drink alcohol, smoke, no drugs, no tea or coffee, no sex before marriage, and we'll take 10% of your gross. And I was fairly decent at it, so to come home and sell advertising space was piss easy to me.
It was uncanny how closely his work in the fitness industry resembled what he'd done in Australia.
Same thing, joining gyms, losing weight, how many kilos, how would you feel when you've lost that weight and you've got to your wedding day? How good are you going to feel? At that moment, that's the time to ask them to join. Let's start today. Let's get you started.
Marlin's experience is just one story. But at any given time, there's more than 50,000 young men and women out there on their mission, knocking on doors in more than 150 countries and teaching in more than 60 languages. It's a numbers game. The more people pounding the pavement, the better the church's chances of growth, success, and stability. But that rings true for the individual Mormon as well. Taking the jump as a youngster, doing what the church asks of you and completing your mission fundamentally boosts your chances of getting all the good things in life a young Mormon might want. If you complete your 2-year mission, you can come back as an RM, a returned missionary. Not to be too blunt, but this means you are hot shit, especially when it comes to the old courtship and marriage game, which you know is meant to follow.
So for the boys, I guess that's like the badge of honour.
We're back with Gayleen.
It's like the best thing you can do that would make you an eligible bachelor. If a girl can marry an RM, that was what you were encouraged to strive for. I remember my friend saying, I don't necessarily want to marry an RM. And everyone goes, oh, because, how dare she say that out loud around us? None of the other people in the room agreed with you.
From the male RM's point of view, marriage after your mission is just a no-brainer. Here's how John, someone we'll meet properly in the next episode, describes what happened the moment he was back from his mission.
I did what all good Mormons coming home from missions do. I looked around for a wife. It's just what you do. You don't think about the rationale behind it. That's the next step.
It's just the next step. But it's also the first link in a chain of positive outcomes. Mission leads to marriage. Marriage leads to children. And that puts you on the first rung of a ladder of leadership roles that can seal your status and your significance in the community. As Gayleen puts it,
building your way up the hierarchy of the church. If you're an RM, that probably places you in a better position to be a bishop and a stake president and then move on up the ranks.
So, that's your Mormon Life 101. You've been introduced to Joseph Smith. You know how the Mormons came to New Zealand. And you've got a sense of what it was like to be an LDS child and teen growing up in the late 20th century. You've got a flavour of Mormon life in Hamilton's Temple View, a tight-knit community with a sense of common purpose and identity, and some clear guidelines about what makes a good life and a good Mormon. And you understand the way service to the church can put your life on a trajectory to success.
I was convinced that I was being commanded of God to marry him, and I believed that.
But there's another version of Mormon life, where growing up in Temple View, surrounded by church members, with a clear life path set out in front of you.
Even though I didn't love him, I really wanted nothing to do with him. I thought he was awful. I thought he was just like my father.
Could instead lead to some very dark places.
And it just goes higher and higher, and it's not dealt with. And meanwhile, these people continue abusing.
Next time on Heaven's Helpline.
I remember thinking, this is really, really weird. The rituals, the waving your hands, the taking clothes on and off. What is this church I belong to?
There was something off about her immediately.
I was never out of his sight for a moment.
I drove them to the women's refuge, and you're not supposed to do that.
Heaven's Helpline was funded by New Zealand On Air and the New Zealand Herald for NZME and iHeartRadio. It was researched, written and presented by me, Murray Jones. My producers were Adam Dudding, who co-wrote the series, and Kirsten Johnston from Popsock Media, who edited and sound designed it. Phil Brownlee is our sound engineer. Music was by Thomas Arbour and Anita Clark. Archival audio came from TVNZ and RNZ. Ethan Sills is executive producer here at New Zealand Herald. If you have a story you'd like to share with me about the LDS Church, or just want to get in touch, email me securely at murrayreports@proton.me or DM me on X at murrayreports. And for more on this podcast, head to nzherald.co.nz/Heaven's Helpline. It's time intensive doing investigations like this. So if you value this kind of journalism, please support it by going to your podcast platform and rating and reviewing the series.